The voice, shrill and sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the tranquil morning air. "Get away from there! That's private property!" Sergeant Major Elias Vance, U.S. Army, retired, didn't so much as flinch. He sat on the edge of his own dock, a simple wooden structure that extended into the placid, glass-like surface of Serenity Lake. A thin veil of mist still clung to the water, and the scent of damp earth and brewing coffee was a comforting balm. He was in the middle of a perfect cast, his fishing line arcing gracefully over the water, when the peace was irrevocably broken. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. For the past week, she had been a discordant note in the symphony of his newfound solitude. Eleanor Finch. Her teenage son, Leo, a lanky boy with an perpetually uncomfortable expression, cringed behind her on the manicured lawn of the adjacent property. "Ma'am, this is my cabin," Eli said, his voice a low, calm rumble that carried easily across the still water. He reeled in his line slowly, the familiar rhythmic click of the reel a counterpoint to the tension coiling in the air. The smell of diesel from her new, ostentatious speedboat, moored at her dock like a parked tank, was an aggressive intrusion. "Bullshit!" she shrieked, the word ugly and out of place in the pristine setting. "I've seen you skulking around for a week. I'm calling 911 right now. We have a trespasser, possibly armed." 20 minutes later, the sound of gravel exploding. Under the tires of a police cruiser announced the arrival of the law. Officer Johnson, a young man with a serious face and an eagerness that hadn't yet been worn down by years on the job, stormed toward the dock, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon. "Sir, step away from the—" He froze mid-sentence. His eyes, sweeping the scene for threats, had locked onto the open tackle box beside Eli. On its lid was a simple, elegant brass nameplate, polished to a soft gleam that read, "SGM Elias Vance, U.S. Army." Officer Johnson's face went white. The aggressive posture melted away, replaced by a ramrod-straight stance of pure, unadulterated respect. He snapped to attention, his back rigid, and rendered a salute so crisp it could have cut the air. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice now, laced with a deference that bordered on awe. He turned to Eleanor Finch, his expression having shifted from professional duty to barely concealed disgust. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you just called the police on a decorated war hero at his own property." Eleanor's mouth fell open, her carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation crumbling into slack-jawed disbelief. She looked like a dying fish, gasping for the water of authority that had just been drained from her world. "What would you do if someone called the cops on you at your own property? Drop a flag emoji for where you're watching from." 2 months. Earlier, Elias Vance had driven up that same gravel road, everything he owned packed into a 20-foot U-Haul. 30 years of military service, from the dusty plains of Iraq to the treacherous mountains of Afghanistan, 4 combat deployments, a Bronze Star for valor, and a lifetime of discipline had all led to this single, quiet moment. His grandfather's fishing cabin, nestled among ancient pines, waited for him like an old, patient friend. The cabin was a testament to a bygone era. Its weathered cedar shingles were the color of morning mist, and its forest green trim was faded from decades of sun and snow. It sat on a 2-acre grandfathered lot, the largest and most private on Serenity Lake. Grandpa Sam, a veteran of World War II, had bought the land in 1944 with his GI Bill money, back when the lake was just a rustic fishing spot for locals, long before the developers had arrived. Now it was surrounded by the Summit at Serenity Lake, a development of 40 upscale modern cabins where lawyers and doctors from the city came to play weekend warrior. Their homes were monuments to modern architecture, all sharp angles, glass walls, and perfectly manicured landscapes. Eli's cabin, with its honest, handmade charm, was an anachronism, a quiet rebellion against the encroaching tide of sterile luxury. He had inherited more than just property. The death of his wife, Anya, from cancer 2 years ago, had left a hollow space in his soul that the rigid structure of military life could no longer fill. He'd gone through the motions, a ghost in his own uniform, until retirement had finally set him free. With no children and no family left, this cabin and its memories were his last anchor. The musty, comforting smell of old pine and his grandfather's. Pipe tobacco still lingered in the corners, a scent that felt more like home than any place he'd been in years. That first week was a blur of healing, physical labor. He replaced the rotted planks on the dock, the rhythmic, solitary hammering a kind of meditation that echoed across the still water. He repainted the cabin's exterior, choosing the same deep forest green that Grandpa Sam had chosen all those years ago. The work was real, honest. It was creation, not destruction, and it felt good. Then came the knock. Eleanor Finch stood on his porch like a real estate brochure come to life. Her blonde bob was perfect. Her designer Lake Casual clothes were immaculate, and her smile was as sharp and predatory as a fishing hook. Behind her lurked her son Leo, a 16-year-old with a slouch and an aura of profound discomfort, who had clearly been dragged along against his will. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her voice a high, brittle thing that could shatter crystal. "I'm Eleanor Finch, president of the Summit Homeowners Association. I just wanted to stop by and discuss some concerns." She handed him an official-looking notice, printed on heavy cardstock. Unauthorized structural modifications. The Summit at Serenity Lake Homeowners Association. Eli scanned the document, the bitter taste of his morning coffee returning to his mouth. A $500 daily fine for dock repairs and exterior painting without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, this is a grandfathered property. It's been in my family since 1944. It's not part of your HOA. "Oh, honey," Eleanor said, her smile never wavering. It was a weaponized smile, designed to patronize and dismiss. That old grandfathering thing doesn't really apply anymore. We've modernized the community standards to protect our property values. We can't have people just doing whatever they want. It brings down the entire aesthetic." The way she said the word people made her son wince. The kid had decent instincts. "The fine starts immediately," she continued, her tone bright and cheerful. "Of course, if you were to find that this community wasn't quite the right fit for you, I do have several high-net-worth clients looking for prime lakefront properties. This lot has tremendous development potential." Eli felt a familiar calm descend over him, the same ice-cold focus he'd felt before walking into a hostile village. His voice was steady, devoid of emotion. "I'll be keeping the cabin, ma'am." Her mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something cold and hard underneath, before the realtor's smile snapped back into place. "We'll see about that. Come along, Leo." As they walked away, Leo glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes offering a silent, fleeting apology. Good kid, wrong mother. That evening, Eli sat on his new dock, watching the sunset paint the water in. Strokes of gold and crimson. The mournful call of a loon echoed across the lake. The same sound his grandfather had loved. Anya's voice whispered in his memory, a gentle echo from a happier time. Some battles choose you, Eli. The only question is whether you're still willing to fight them. He pulled out his phone and took a clear photograph of the violation notice. It was an old habit from 30 years of dealing with military bureaucracy. Document everything. The paper felt flimsy between his calloused fingers, but he recognized the weight behind the threat. This wasn't about dock planks or paint colors. This was about power, territory, and who belonged where. His neighbor, Mrs. Gable, waved from her deck next door. She was a sweet, sharp-witted woman in her late 70s, a Polish grandmother who had lived in her family's original cabin since the 1960s. She'd brought him a welcome casserole on his first day and had shared stories about his grandfather's legendary fish fries. "Everything all right, dear?" she called, her voice carrying a note of concern. "Just getting acquainted with the neighbors, Mrs. Gable." The old woman's expression darkened. "That Finch woman been bothering you?" "She's been a plague on this community since she moved in 5 years ago. Pushed out the Clarks last year with her HOA nonsense. Buried them in fines until they had to sell." Interesting. Eli filed that piece of information away. "In the Army, you learn to spot patterns, to distinguish between isolated incidents and a systematic campaign." This was starting to smell like the latter. As darkness fell over Serenity Lake, Eli made himself a simple dinner of grilled fish and planned his next move. Some people mistook patience for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. The next morning brought another surprise visitor, a county inspector with a clipboard and a deeply bewildered expression. Jim Rodriguez had been a building inspector for 15 years, and he'd never been called out for something this patently ridiculous. "Mr. Vance, I'm here about a complaint regarding unpermitted dock modifications," he said, gesturing at the perfectly reasonable, freshly replaced planks. "Honestly, sir, I'm scratching my head here. This is basic maintenance. We're talking maybe $50 in lumber. The paperwork to file a permit would cost more than the job." Across the road, partially hidden by a stand of aspens, sat Eleanor. Finch, in her white Mercedes, a telephoto camera lens pointed at the crime scene. The morning sun glinted off her windshield, creating little rainbow flashes that would have been pretty if they weren't so pathetic. "Who filed the complaint?" Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. He savored the bitter warmth of his coffee. "The HOA president. She's called our office 6 times this week about your property alone." Rodriguez lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "Dock repairs, exterior painting, even a complaint that your American flag is technically oversized according to some obscure county code from the 1970s. Between you and me," he added, his eyes flicking to the Bronze Star license plate on Eli's truck, "I served 2 tours with the Guard. My nephew was 82nd Airborne. Thank you for your service." "Afghanistan, 2009. Eli replied quietly. The inspector's entire demeanor shifted. The professional weariness was replaced by a look of genuine solidarity. He glanced meaningfully toward Eleanor's surveillance operation. "That woman might want to do her homework before picking fights with decorated veterans," he muttered, before officially clearing the violation and driving away. But Eleanor was just warming up. That afternoon, a post appeared on the private Facebook page for the Summit at Serenity Lake Neighbors. Safety alert. A newcomer in the area has shown aggressive behavior toward community leadership and refuses to follow established safety and aesthetic guidelines. As a community, we must be vigilant. I am concerned for our children's well-being. The post had 3 angry face reactions and 1 confused comment from someone's grandmother asking what aggressive behavior meant. Leo had apparently liked it by accident, then quickly unliked it, the digital equivalent of a Freudian slip. By evening, she had escalated to filing a noise complaint with the sheriff's department. The deputy who responded, the same Officer Johnson from the trespassing incident, looked around the peaceful, silent lakefront setting like he'd been called to investigate a unicorn sighting. Someone reported loud construction noise during business hours, sir. You doing any hammering? I replaced 3 loose deck boards around noon, Eli answered truthfully. The deputy's radio squawked with actual emergencies, a domestic disturbance, a possible break-in. Real police work. Well, that's perfectly legal, he said with an apologetic sigh. Sorry for bothering you, Sergeant Major. After he left, Eli sat on his deck and planned his counterattack. In the military, he'd learned that bureaucratic warfare followed predictable patterns. His old company sergeant used to have a saying, "When they come at you with paperwork, you better come back with better paperwork." He remembered something from his divorce attorney years ago: HOA transparency laws. In most states, any homeowner had the legal right to demand complete financial records, meeting minutes, and contracts from their HOA board. The board was legally required to produce them within a set number of business days. Most corrupt boards, he recalled, folded immediately when faced with actual scrutiny. Daylight was the best disinfectant for shady dealings. He drafted the formal request that night, his language precise and clinical, citing the relevant state statutes. 30 years of writing military reports had taught him the power of unemotional, fact-based communication. While waiting for Eleanor's inevitable stonewalling, Eli installed a state-of-the-art security camera system around his property. The gentle, almost silent whir of the motors as the cameras adjusted their focus reminded him of the perimeter security systems on forward operating bases. Familiar, reassuring sounds of protection. Mrs. Gable arrived with a warm apple pie, Next evening, the scent of cinnamon and butter mixing with the crisp pine air. "Your grandfather would be grinning from ear to ear," she said, settling into a porch rocker. "Sam never backed down from a neighborhood bully either. Tell me about these other families she pushed out." Mrs. Gable's knuckles whitened around her coffee cup as she spoke. "The Clarks, a young couple. He was a teacher. She was pregnant with their first baby. Eleanor cited them for their mailbox being 2 inches too low, for the color of their welcome mat, for their car being improperly parked in their own driveway. She buried them in thousands of dollars of fines until they were forced to sell for half the market value just to escape." "Anyone else?" "The Kowalskis, on Pine Street, an elderly couple. She claimed their bird feeders attracted rodents and vermin and fined them $200 a day. They couldn't afford groceries, let alone a lawyer. They sold and moved into an assisted living facility." Eli recognized the tactical approach. Systematically target vulnerable residents, the young, the old, those without financial resources. Overwhelm them with bureaucratic harassment, force financial capitulation. It was classic asymmetric warfare, civilian edition. But Eleanor had made one crucial miscalculation. She had engaged someone who actually understood how to fight back. The next morning, Leo jogged past during Eli's coffee ritual on the dock. The teenager's pace slowed, an internal conflict written plainly across his young face. "Morning, Leo." "Hey, Mr. Vance," the kid mumbled, looking like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I'm sorry about my mom. She gets really intense when she thinks someone's challenging her authority." "That's not your responsibility, son." Leo glanced around, making sure they were alone. "Since my dad left, she's been different, angry all the time. She's constantly talking about this huge development deal that could set us up for life. Something about clearing obstacles from prime lakefront properties. There it was. The motive. This wasn't just personal harassment fueled by a lust for power. This was business. Eleanor was systematically clearing properties for a development client, earning fat commissions while destroying lives. That afternoon brought Eleanor's predictable response to his financial records request, delivered via certified mail. Denied. "Your request is deemed frivolous and a form of harassment against volunteer HOA leadership." Wrong answer. Eli immediately filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board, attaching a copy of his request and her denial. His fingers moved with the practiced rhythm of military efficiency. He was building a paper trail. His grandfather had taught him patience while fishing. Sometimes you had to wait all day, feeding the line out, feeling for the slightest nibble, before you found exactly the right moment to set the hook. The cameras captured everything now. Every time her white Mercedes drove slowly past his property, every time she stood on her deck with binoculars, every late-night visit from unfamiliar cars. He was letting her think she was the hunter, while all along she was the one walking into the trap. 3 days later, Eleanor called an emergency HOA meeting. The community center smelled like burnt coffee and desperation as residents trickled in, most of them looking confused about what constituted an emergency on a Tuesday evening. Eleanor had dressed for battle in a sharp power suit, her hair freshly blown, her smile a weapon. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice resonating with a false sense of urgency. "We have serious security concerns to address. Recent violations of community standards by certain individuals threaten our property values and our family's safety." She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation filled with vague threats and grainy photos of Eli's property. "I'm proposing an emergency rule amendment requiring pre-approval for all property modifications, regardless of so-called grandfathered status," she announced, her eyes finding Eli in the back row. "Furthermore, I'm recommending a $5,000 retroactive fine for any existing unauthorized improvements." The room shifted uncomfortably. Most of the long-time residents had grandfathered properties with sheds, docks, and fences that had been there for decades. That's when Mrs. Gable stood up, all 5 feet of Polish grandmother fury. "Brenda, honey," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "My family's been here since 1962. Are you trying to fine me for my garden shed that's older than you are?" Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, but Eli had done his homework. He'd spent his lunch break at the county recorder's office, diving into public records. He'd found Eleanor's divorce settlement, which showed her struggling with a $4,200 monthly mortgage she couldn't really afford. He'd also found the incorporation papers for her mysterious client, Lakeshore Development, LLC, a Delaware shell company structured to hide the money trail. "I'd like to request a postponement of this vote," Eli said calmly, standing up. The room turned toward his voice. Proper legal notice was not given for rule changes of this magnitude. State law requires 14 days written notice to all homeowners for any amendment to the covenants. Eleanor's composure cracked. "This is an emergency meeting addressing immediate safety concerns." "What emergency exactly?" Eli asked, pulling out his phone. "Mind if I record this? Colorado is a one-party consent state. The vote, which was supposed to be a formality, fell apart. 3 board members abstained, and 2 others started asking uncomfortable questions about proper procedures. The motion was postponed. Eleanor's mask slipped completely. "Fine," she hissed, "but don't think this is over." As residents filed out, Leo lingered near the back. He approached Eli hesitantly. "Mr. Vance," he whispered, "my mom keeps talking about my college fund money being invested in this big business deal. She says once these lakefront properties get developed, we'll never have to worry about money again. Is she doing something illegal?" The kid was sharper than his mother. Gave him credit for. "Leo," Eli said gently, "I can't give you legal advice, but I will say this. When adults start talking about never having to worry about money again, that's usually when you should start worrying." Kyle nodded solemnly, processing the life lesson. He was caught in an impossible position, and the weight of it was visible on his young shoulders. He was beginning to understand that the real threat to his future wasn't a decorated veteran fixing up a cabin. It was his own mother's insatiable greed.